This is Clifford. He was a surgeon and a pilot, and he was flying to Delaware to perform a critical surgery on a patient the next morning, but unfortunately he made several mistakes and he couldn't land the plane. By the time he asked for help, it was too late and he crashed just a few miles from the runway. That's why today I'm going to share with you everything that went wrong on this flight and the real pilot mistake that got Clifford killed. I'm Hoover, and welcome to your Pilot Debrief. Our story begins in Sandersville, Georgia on the evening of January 13th, 2013, when a 55-year-old pilot named Clifford boarded his plane for a routine flight to the Summit Airport in Delaware. Dr. Clifford was an internationally recognized orthopedic traumatologist. He also served for 28 years as a commander in the Medical Corps of the Navy Reserve, and while he was on active duty, he was a medical officer for the Navy SEALs, and he was selected to the Presidential Medical Support Team for President George H.W. Bush. According to the investigation, Clifford had a private pilot license with a single-engine airplane rating, and he also had an instrument rating that he obtained on June 9, 2010, about 2.5 years prior to the crash. Over the years, he accumulated about 600 total hours of flight time, of which about 77 hours were actual instrument flying and 35 hours were simulated instrument flying. The aircraft he was flying was a 1970 Piper Cherokee that he owned, and there was nothing mechanically wrong with the aircraft that contributed to the crash. He planned to take off at 13:30 local time, and the flight was scheduled to take 3 hours and 45 minutes. That meant he would be landing at sunset around 17:15. One of the biggest threats to this flight was the weather. Clifford got a weather briefing at 10:15 local time, and the forecast for the Newcastle Airport in Wilmington, about 10 miles away from his destination, was overcast skies at 400 feet and 2 miles visibility due to mist from 1300 to 1600 local time. However, from 1600 to 1900, conditions were expected to improve to 1200-foot ceilings and 6 miles visibility. Based on that forecast, Clifford chose the Baltimore-Washington International Airport as his alternate. BWI was forecasting 300-foot ceilings and 2 miles visibility, but they also showed conditions improving to 3,000-foot ceilings and 6 miles visibility around 1700, which was when Clifford was expecting to land. Basically, there was a blanket of mist or fog covering most of the airports in the region, and everyone expected that to burn off by the late afternoon or early evening. That being said, you should always plan for the worst case scenario and be prepared if the weather doesn't cooperate. Based on the forecast, he should have gotten a weather update prior to his departure, and he should have been asking for weather updates throughout the flight. The NTSB wasn't able to determine if that ever happened, and Clifford took off around 13:30 local to begin the flight. According to the investigation, the first 3 hours of the flight were relatively uneventful as Clifford made his way northeast. The flight time gave him plenty of opportunity to get weather updates and prepare himself for the instrument approach. As Clifford began his initial descent for the approach to the Summit Airport, the controller advised him that another aircraft went missed approach out of Summit and was also unable to land at Wilmington and had to divert out of Philadelphia's airspace. I honestly think this caught Clifford by surprise because he said, "I'm going to have to divert, and let's look for an airport that I can divert to." First of all, I found it interesting that Clifford didn't ask what type of approaches were in use when the other aircraft couldn't land. He didn't bother to ask what the reported ceilings were or how bad the weather was, and even though the weather might not have been suitable, it's at least worth asking. But instead, it was almost like he just accepted the fact that he was going to have to divert. The second point I want to bring up is that when he said, "Let's look for an airport that I can divert to me that indicated he didn't plan ahead and already have a divert airfield in mind. His original plan had BWI as his alternate, but he never asked the controller about the weather there. And even if he did, it wouldn't have been a viable option because the fog layer never burned off, and BWI was reporting a quarter-mile visibility, with fog reducing the vertical visibility to 200 feet. At this point, he still had plenty of options with about 2 hours of fuel remaining, and I like how he didn't panic. He flew the aircraft first, he took a few minutes to come up with the plan, and then he started talking on the radio to get help from the controller. Aviate, navigate, communicate. That's what you're supposed to do. He asked the controller about the weather at Salisbury, and the current conditions were a 400-foot overcast ceiling and 8 miles visibility. Now, this is where I think he should have at least taken a few minutes to think about that weather and figure out if the airport had an approach that would give him a reasonable chance of landing. The fact that he had to ask the controller what the airport code was reflects to me that he hadn't even looked at their approaches yet and that he wasn't familiar with the airport. The reason why this is so important is because based on the winds, Salisbury was using runway 14, and the GPS approach to that runway gets you down to 306 feet above the ground. That doesn't give you a lot of room to work with when you have a 400-foot ceiling. Either way, he got the aircraft turned around and started heading towards Salisbury. Because it was going to take about 20 to 30 minutes to get there, that would have been plenty of time for Clifford to review the approach and check the weather at a few other airfields to see if there was a better option. Unfortunately, there's no evidence that he considered any other airfields, and eventually he was cleared for the RNAV GPS approach to runway 14 and was told to contact the Salisbury Tower. He reported inbound on the final approach and was cleared to land. Even though the minimum altitude on the approach was 306 feet above the ground, he discontinued the approach at 581 feet when he was 1.7 miles from the runway. He made a sharp turn to the right and told the controller he was executing the missed approach. Unfortunately, this was just the beginning of Clifford's struggles. Clifford turned to the north and contacted the approach controller, and it took him 18 minutes from the time he went missed approach to the time he flew back around to the final approach fix to try again. The only reason I bring this up is because pilots need to understand when it comes to fuel management, when an airport is operating under IFR conditions like this and you have to fly the missed approach, it could take you 20 minutes or longer to get vectored back around and try again. Now, technically, I don't think there was anything wrong with Clifford trying the approach a second time because he never got down to the minimums on that first try, so it was worth taking another look to see if he could get below the weather. Unfortunately, the second approach was even worse than the first because this time he only descended to 928 feet and then he veered to the right again, continuing his descent to 529 feet before telling the controller he was executing the missed approach. This was very dangerous because once you turn away from the approach course, you're no longer in that protected zone of the approach, and that means you're not guaranteed clearance from terrain or obstacles. As soon as he turned to the right off course, he needed to immediately begin a climb and turn back in the direction of the runway. It's also worth pointing out that the missed approach procedure says to climb to 2,000 feet and proceed direct to Fryer, which is basically straight ahead on the other side of the airfield. However, on both missed approaches, Clifford made a right turn to the south. If you're going to fly an instrument approach, you need to brief and understand the missed approach procedure and be ready to fly it. According to the radio transcript, the reason why Clifford couldn't fly the approach was because he said he was having trouble with his GPS. The NTSB didn't find anything wrong with the GPS device in his aircraft, and that's why I think it's more likely that Clifford just didn't have enough experience flying a GPS approach down to minimums. That being said, there are two important things that we haven't talked about regarding this whole sequence of events so far. The first is that when Clifford began that first missed approach, the tower controller called the approach controller to let him know that Clifford had gone missed approach, and he was basically shocked that Clifford had even tried the approach to begin with due to the weather. When Clifford was about to try the approach a second time, the approach controller called the tower to let him know, and the tower controller responded, "Tell him I said fair winds and following seas," which basically means good luck, and both controllers said they hope he makes it. It was really frustrating to read this transcript because the controllers weren't that busy, and when they recognized that Clifford was struggling, instead of wishing him good luck, they could have pointed out to him that the winds were calm and Salisbury had an ILS approach to runway 32 that he could have tried. The reason you need to know this is because you don't need GPS to fly an ILS approach, and the ILS approach minimums are only about 200 feet above the ground, so it would have made for a very simple approach to get below the weather. Don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to blame the controllers because first of all, I'm sure they felt terrible about what happened and hindsight is always 20/20. Second, they didn't know about Clifford's GPS problems until after that second missed approach. But you have to keep in mind that the whole point of a debrief is to use this scenario as a learning opportunity, and if someone had mentioned the ILS to Clifford, then it might have prevented what happened next. After the second missed approach, Clifford decided that he wanted to try a different airport, and he turned to the north to head to the Delaware Coastal Airport in Georgetown. Before we find out what happened next, I want to point out that when Clifford originally reversed his course to head south to Salisbury at 1649, the weather at the Georgetown Airport was overcast skies at 700 feet and 10 miles visibility. This would have made it a much better option, and that's why he should have taken the time to assess the weather before picking Salisbury as his divert. Unfortunately, because it took him an hour to get to Salisbury and try the approach twice, by the time he decided to try Georgetown, the weather had gotten a lot worse. The reason why the controller asked him to say his intentions is because the lowest minimums on the approach are 310 feet above the ground, and that means there's almost no chance that Clifford is going to be able to get below the weather. Technically, because this is a Part 91 flight, Clifford is allowed to do what's sometimes called a look and see approach. That means he can fly the approach and see if he can get below the weather, but in no case is he allowed to go below the approach minimums. However, that's not something I would recommend when you've already flown 2 missed approaches and now you're heading to your second alternate. If you get in a situation like this and you're not sure what to do, just declare an emergency and ask for help. Clifford was flying single pilot IFR and it was now nighttime and he was probably getting worn out. That's a very dangerous situation to be in, and instead of asking the controllers for help, Clifford decided to continue the approach. He struggled with the GPS again and he veered off course to the left and then tried to correct back to the right at the last second. This was extremely dangerous and he got as low as 250 feet above the ground, which was 60 feet below the approach minimums. Now it's possible that he saw the runway and that's why he went below the minimums, but he wasn't able to land and he had to execute a missed approach. Clifford contacted the controller, and when she asked him what he wanted to do, he said he was going to try it again. Now, in my opinion, this wasn't because Clifford was being reckless. I think he had just fallen so far behind the aircraft that he didn't know what else to do and he figured he could make it work. Unfortunately, just when he thought the situation couldn't get any worse, Clifford is about to have another big problem to deal with. The controller told Clifford to climb and maintain 3,000 feet, and he asked if he could go to 2,000 because he was running pretty low, meaning he's running low on fuel. To be perfectly clear, telling the controller that you're running low doesn't do anything for you. Instead, you have 2 options. You can declare minimum fuel, and that means you can't accept any delays, or you need to declare emergency fuel, and that means you need to land as soon as possible, and that way you get priority over other traffic. Instead of trying to verify Clifford's fuel status, the controller asked him if he needed an alternate airport to land at. Clifford asked if there was anything easier, and the controller recommended he try 33 November, which is the Delaware Air Park located about 5 miles northwest of Dover Air Force Base. The weather there was 500-foot overcast with 10 miles visibility. A minute later, the controller cleared him direct to Smyrna for the VOR approach to runway 27. I thought this was a bad idea for a couple of reasons. First of all, if you look at the approach, there's a note in the top left corner that says the procedure is not available for use at night. That means Clifford can't legally fly the approach. Now keep in mind, he didn't ask for the approach, the controller just gave it to him, and right now he's so far behind the aircraft that he's doing whatever he's told and just scrambling to keep up. Second, even if it was legal to fly the approach, the minimums are 477 feet above the ground and the ceilings are at 500 feet. So it's not the best option for the third airport that you're diverting to, especially considering that airport had GPS approaches that go as low as 400 feet. I think this led to some confusion because the controller cleared him for the VOR, then corrected herself to say RNAV, which is the GPS approach, and then 30 seconds later cleared him for the VOR again. Before I explain what happened next, I want to warn you that this part of the story might be difficult for some people to watch, but it's very important to understand exactly what happened at the end of the flight. As Clifford was about to begin the approach, that's when all the holes in the Swiss cheese lined up. He finally declared an emergency, saying he was out of fuel and going down. He was told to turn right to a heading of 010 for the ILS approach to runway 19, but the controller never told him that this is actually for an approach at Dover Air Force Base, which would now be Clifford's 4th divert option. Clifford started to turn to the assigned heading, but he kept the turn going until the aircraft was turned around and pointed south. My guess is that's because he knew he was out of fuel and the right engine quit and he was trying to find the closest runway to land. According to the flight data, as he pointed south, runway 27 at the Delaware Air Park was the closest option because Dover Air Force Base was over 7 miles away. 30 seconds later, he said again that he was out of fuel and going down. The controller told him Dover was 8 miles away to the south and asked him to report the field in sight. The only problem is Clifford is at 1,500 feet, making it impossible for him to see the field because of the weather. About 30 seconds later, Clifford was only 6 miles from the field, and the controller told him they were turning up the lights as the situation was getting more desperate. The controller kept asking if he had the field in sight as Clifford continued descending, unable to maintain altitude. He had no idea if he was going the right direction, but the controller tried to reassure him and said that he could expect to land on runway 14. Unfortunately, there aren't any instrument approaches to runway 14, making it almost impossible for Clifford to find the runway at night with the low clouds and limited visibility while trying to manage a single-engine aircraft. These were the last radio calls that Clifford would make. Moments later, he crashed in the woods about 2 miles from the runway. The investigation discovered there was no fuel remaining in the right tank and only a half gallon in the left. By the time he crashed, he'd been flying for over 5 hours, and it had been 2 hours since he reversed his course to try and approach at Salisbury. Now that you know how Clifford crashed, we need to talk about one of the most shocking parts of this entire story and the real pilot mistake that got him killed. When Clifford was on the missed approach at Georgetown and he first told the controller he was running pretty low, the truth is that he had less than 20 minutes of fuel remaining. As Clifford turned north, he noticed he was going to fly right over the top of Dover Air Force Base. That's why he asked the controller if there was any chance he could land at Dover. Unfortunately, the controller told him negative, unless it's an emergency, there is no way you can land here. I want to be perfectly clear. I'm not blaming the controller for what happened. I think it could have been handled a little bit differently, but ultimately Clifford is the pilot in command, and he should have responded saying that he was declaring an emergency for low fuel and told the controller he would be landing at Dover. The weather at Dover was 500 feet overcast, and they had an ILS and GPS approach with minimums as low as 200 feet, which would have given Clifford plenty of room to get below the weather. This was a tragic story because I'm sure Clifford was a great man and also an incredible surgeon, and my heart goes out to his friends and family. That's why it's tough to say that perhaps the real pilot mistake that got Clifford killed was that he was just unprepared for how tough this flight was going to be. Better pre-flight planning and reviewing the weather en route would have helped him handle the decision to divert. He also didn't have enough experience flying GPS approaches down to minimums, and unfortunately he wasn't assertive enough to tell the controllers what he was going to do or the help that he needed. He probably felt the pressure to make the flight happen since he was performing surgery the next day, and that's why, in my opinion, the safer option would have been for him to just fly commercial. I hope you're able to learn something from this debrief, and if you did, then be sure to check out one of these other videos on the screen, and thanks for your support.